very first data quality research project outputs that we had tracked to was this is going way back, but she set a marker very early on, and that right.
Okay, thank you. I'm also aware that we're a little bit behind on our time, so I'm going to give a very short input and then hand over to Jackie. Okay, so just the context, remember, when this work was done, this was sort of 10 years into democracy. Everyone's very interested in starting to measure sort of changes that were evident in society, and one of the big questions was about the employment problem, and we were interested in measuring sort of the levels. Okay, so at this point, many, going back right to the beginning of today, many researchers were stacking the surveys, and then we put the, we discussed about thinking about putting all your surveys together and starting to look at trends. And these are the kinds of analyses that started coming out. Here we have all these surveys stacked on top of each other, looking at working males, and you can see some of the age profile, and you can see that while they're fairly similar, there are some differences across the surveys. For example, this one shows quite clearly that the 1995 survey was finding higher levels of male employment. So that was obviously something interesting to look at, but another way to think about it, and to sort of a relevant question, was to think about individuals aging through these profiles. So not necessarily comparing individuals at the same age in different years, but thinking of a group of individuals that is aging through the surveys, and to then say, if you track a cohort, so a group of individuals born in the same year, and you look at them over time, can you see patterns that are, or can you see changes that different groups of individuals are experiencing different, whoops, did I go the wrong way? I think I might have had that in twice. Okay, so this is what we call the cohort approach, or what is the cohort approach? It's when you track a group of individuals through successive surveys, and you create like a synthetic panel. So this was before the time of NIDS, for example, and there are many benefits of doing it this way as well. So we had multiple waves of, or multiple surveys, we put them together, and then we observed groups of individuals born in the same year over time. And yeah, so this creates a useful way of looking at things. And yeah, so this was, as Martin said, going back a long time ago, and it was interesting to look at the paper again last night from my thesis and with Martin and an SAJE article. So I'll just give you a quick description, or a quick input from this initial paper. So as I said, at the time we were using the data from 1994 OHS to the 2004 LFS. And what you see here are a subset of cohorts defined by the age where they were in 1994. And so what you can see here, this is not economically active. So you can see this drop down in the proportion in the labor force. I mean, not economically active, and they're all sort of reaching a similar level, minimum level. But what you see is that younger cohorts seem to be joining the labor force earlier. So this made us think, okay, so if you're joining the labor force earlier at this age, it means that you're exiting the schooling system earlier. And so we looked at that, and we found, well, that's not really happening, that younger cohorts are not getting less education, they're actually increasing their levels of education. And so you can then, so in all this cohort analysis, it's very much a descriptive approach and putting pieces of the puzzle together and looking at changes. So that another side of the labor market experience is then obviously to look at employment. And what you can see here is that increase in labor force participation of the younger cohorts was driving this increase in unemployment among young cohorts or younger cohorts. And so we saw both an increase in the levels of employment and it becoming higher, the increase in the peak, but also at a younger age. Yeah, so in a way you could, at the time, what this was really showing was that this push from the schooling system into the labor force was one of the driving factors increasing sort of youth unemployment at the time. Yeah, so I think I'm going to leave it at there. This is just a graph to show that from the cross sections, you would see sort of a fairly consistent, if not increasing peak, but at a similar age. But when you start to unpack it for different cohorts, you saw that peak was also shifting to a younger age. Thanks.
Yeah, so Jackie, Nicola has already introduced what cohort analysis is. So then we wanted to find out what has happened to the gender wage gap over time. And the data quality issues have been discussed all morning. So we wanted to know what has happened in South Africa over time. If you analyze the wage gap using cross-sectional analysis, you may find different answers because you're observing men and women at different ages at any one particular time. So what we know about the wage gap is that it increases by age. So it's quite narrow when people are just joining the labor market, and it increases with age, mostly because of the break in labor force participation of women around childbearing age, and also earnings increase with age because of experience. So you want to look at men and women at a particular age and compare how these earnings look. So what we see here, what has happened to the wage gap in South Africa is, so the two theories are true, that earnings increase with age and that the wage gap is much narrower for the younger cohorts and it widens for older cohorts. Earnings have increased over time. So when you compare the cohort that was born in 1975 and the cohort that was born in 1965, so you can see that the trend of earnings is higher for the younger cohort at the same age. So for example, when you look at the cohort born in 1975, so that is the black line. When you compare similar females at the same age for the cohort that was born 10 years earlier, you can see that their earnings are above those ones that were born much earlier. Yeah, thanks.
That's the end of that session, but time for questions. Question time?
Definitely post-lunch energy. Thank you so much, the presenters. I'm not like, well, I'm still learning about the cohort analysis. So my question is just a simple one to say, when you are doing the cohorts, the groups, are they like just that particular year? For example, from Jack, you said like those that were born in 1955. Is it 1955 going back or just that 1955? Like the age groups, it's just that that's one point in a year, or it's like a range like from 1955 going back, 1965, between 1956 and 1965, or yeah, something like that.
Okay. Should I answer? I'm not sure I quite understood your question. Probably because I rushed during my presentation, I might try and explain a little bit more how that is calculated. So the idea here is you're trying, so the ideal data set would be a panel data set. So, so then you can track individuals over time. But since we do not have such a data set that is running over such a long period of time, you want to assume that if you have several cross sections, then on average, people who are the same age during that particular survey have on average the same characteristics. So then what you want to do is, so you calculate a cohort as the years someone is observed in the survey minus their age. So then you get their date of birth. So the assumption is, since these people were existing during the same macroeconomic conditions and in the same country or in the same area, so their characteristics should be quite similar. So then you're tracking them from the time you observe them in the survey for the number of cross sections you have. So the more cross sections, the better. So what you're seeing there, if you see 1955, for example, it's all the people who were born in 1955. So you're observing them when they're, for example, at 45, 46, 47, until you can no longer observe them in the survey. So you're observing their earnings continually. So you're comparing similar people over time on average, because it's not the same individual you're observing.
Just one thing, you can, sometimes people take 5-year cohorts, so you don't have to take single-year cohorts. But also one correction, so Jackie says the ideal data set would be a panel. That's only if you've got no attrition. I mean, so one big advantage of cohort data is that the only attrition you've got is the people who are actually dying out of the cohort, kind of like. But for that, it's really important that the cohort be closed, in the sense that, so I've seen people do it on treating employed people as a cohort. That's not a cohort, because you've got people entering and exiting it, which is kind of like means that whatever you're tracking over time then gets the time trend confused between, you know, composition, who's actually in there. So age cohorts are pretty good on the whole, unless you've got massive pandemic blowing through, in which case it's not quite as closed as you want it.
So thanks, Jackie, for the good presentation, and Nicola as well. So for Jackie, what I wanted to find out is, we're seeing that earnings is increasing over time, but we also know that in South Africa, inequality has increased over time. So is it that earnings has increased towards the top end of the distribution, like across all the ages, or do we have certain ages where the earnings is increasing more proportionately than others, and which are those ones, and are they the ones that are really driving the inequality then in South Africa? Thanks.
Okay, that's a good question and a complicated one that I have to. So we know that the level of inequality in a country affects the gender wage gap, especially depending on what is moving that inequality. So if it's the rich getting richer and then you have fewer women at the top, then you're going to see on average an increase in the gender wage gap. So we have yet to analyze, to do that analysis for the South African economy, especially looking at what is the composition of women at the top of the distribution. But I would not be surprised because we still have women underrepresented at the top of the wage distribution. But I don't have the exact results that I can tell you this is what is moving this. In terms of ages, so what we saw from that graph is that earnings increase over your life cycle. So the gap is going to be much bigger in the between 35 and 45. Then you're having women now trying to come back to the labor market, but then it's like there is some resistance because by the time your earnings catch up to what your trajectory would have been if you had had a continuous participation in the labor market. So I hope I've answered your question.
Other questions?
There's a question online. So how do we interpret when two cohorts intersect? The lines touch each other. Nicola, do you want to take this one?
So are they saying at the same age, the lines are intersecting? Okay, so if you look at, for example, the employment cohorts in the similar paper, you'll see that the trajectories overlap, so that at a certain age, they're intersecting. And that means that the share employed, for example, is the same at that same age for different cohorts. So in the figures that I was showing, if you'd taken a specific age and you looked at not economically active, you saw that it was dropping for a given age. And that's showing that there's an increase in labor force participation of that group. So when they intersect, it means that they have they're experiencing a similar, whatever you're looking at. I also just wanted to comment on the question that you raised earlier about the inequality, and I don't know if it was specifically about gender gaps, but I think it's also interesting to think of the shifts in educational attainment, especially at the top end of the distribution, and the fact that we have more women, or there's been quite a rapid increase in qualification attainment at that level. So that could also be part of the story.